Hi everyone. We are all aware of Gandhiji's greatness and how he led our country to independence from the Britishers. But what we are not aware of is that how Gandhiji, with the help of the experience he had gathered during the long drawn out struggle, identified the foundational elements which will shape our country post-independence. Had it not been for Gandhiji's inspirational and thought-provoking ideologies, who knows how our nation and its constitution might have turned out? So today, in our Gandhiji Jayanti special episode, we shall decode and understand how Gandhiji paved the path for our country's foreign policy, how the economic policy making in India was influenced by his ideals and thoughts, and how the democratic structure in India found its roots and establishment in Gandhiji's concepts and abstractions. People throughout our educational lives, we have been taught that it was Nehruji who shaped India's foreign policy, since he was the one who had the most international exposure and experience, because of which he was also India's first external minister and not only the prime minister. In fact, even if you would have this discussion with your grandparents or parents, I'm sure they will tell you the same thing. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's not true. But what I'm trying to say is that even though Panditji was the curator and navigator for India's foreign policy, it was Gandhiji who provided the spirit and philosophy to it. So the question is, how exactly did Gandhiji instill his philosophies in India's foreign policy, which are even today being followed and implemented in diplomatic realms? Well, you see, Gandhiji was a visionary. And throughout his journey for independence, he was not only planning his next moves according to the Brits' actions and responses, he was also planning 10 steps ahead for when India will achieve its independence. So since the beginning, he had always articulated his thoughts of putting what is advantageous to the country and its material interests above all else. And they were either directly in the form of his ideologies of satyagraha, non-violence and morality in the context of humans and nations, or indirectly via his metaphorical teachings. So fundamentally, his students such as Panditji took this as preserving the newly won freedom while simultaneously achieving unity and economic development. And this resulted in three pillars of India's foreign policy, which are non-alignment, the pursuit of peace when possible, national interests of India itself. These three pillars even today are reflected in India's foreign policy, which can be corroborated by Russia-Ukraine war example. India's abstention at the UN General Assembly to vote and condemn Russia for its war initiation is formally termed as proactive neutrality, which in basic terms means non-alignment, and by doing so, India has kept its own interests first and foremost, which meant not condemning Russia, who has been India's diplomatic and defense supplies partner since decades. As for the third pillar of pursuit of peace, India has been involved in humanitarian assistance in affected areas of Ukraine, which totally justifies and falls in line with the foreign policy philosophy which Gandhiji preached and instilled. But the question here arises, is India justified in following such a policy of non-alignment? Well, from a historical perspective, yes. India is totally justified. You see, India has always been a land of great rulers such as Ashoka, who throughout his life renounced war and instead insisted on following and preaching the teachings of great Buddha. So to follow such a policy of non-alignment would be to follow in footsteps of our ancestors, and in a way to follow our traditions and culture. And that is why India's stand of its foreign policy, whether it be during the Cold War of the 1940s or during the nuclearization debate in the 90s or now, has always been constant and the same, and I think will be the same with its deep roots seated in Gandhiji's ideologies. People are moving from foreign policy to economic development tangent in the post-independence era. Gandhiji's ability to comprehend the foundational elements behind circumstances and influence on him of writers like Ruskin Bond and Leo Tolstoy formed the basis for his thoughts and ideals. He understood that India, which was a poor country at the time, with unemployment looming like a sword at its neck, needed to adopt a bottom-up approach if the people of the country were to be elevated from poverty. This was driven out of his staunch beliefs such as the heterodox doctrine, dignity of manual labor, and moral superiority of self-employment. Now to understand this, people please listen to this very carefully. The heterodox doctrine states that a nation's wealth is neither its production or consumption of goods, but rather its people, which further expands on the dignity of manual labor concept in the sense that self-employment or independent work is only morally superior if they fulfill the responsibility of providing dignity to the labor of the nation. And in practical and implementation terms, this means that the self-supported people, with the assistance of the dignified labor populace, will provide for the necessities and consumables for the requirement of the cities, so that self-sufficiency, entrepreneurship and proud employment could be manifested from the grassroots of the country. But he also recognized the need for industrialization for the nation's survival, but advised to tread the path of industries cautiously. People, if you analyze here carefully, Gandhiji's concern towards industrialization was very rational, since he put forward a practical issue that if India was not only focused on Western technology implementation, then this could further aggravate the situation of unemployment, as more and more machines will be replacing the labor of the nation, whereas the nation was in dire need of economic inclusion at the time. And this is where the geniusness of Panditji and India's most important historical unsung figure, Mr. Mahalanobis, came into picture. They understood that Gandhiji's philosophy was absolutely correct, given the times they were witnessing, and thus they incorporated Gandhiji's models and doctrines in the 5-year plans presented for the nation's development. The first 5-year plan was solely based on the focus of primary sector, which is the sector responsible for extraction and production of raw materials such as fishing, farming, forestry and mining sectors. So agricultural development was the main driver for the first 5-year plan, which was totally in line with Gandhiji's ideologies of individual empowerment and labor development as the driver for economic development. But the second 5-year plan identified the shortcomings of its previous iteration, in the sense that only agricultural development cannot sustain the development of the whole nation, and industrialization was the need of the hour, as well as for rapid expansion in terms of technological opportunities and GDP growth. This then led to the discussion between Nehruji and Mr. Mahalanobis to revise the model in such a way that it could be a balance of Gandhiji's ideologies as well as the advanced industrial policy development's inclusion as well. But how was the balance achieved in policy terms, and what was the economic rationale behind it? Well, Mr. Mahalanobis knew that India, who was robbed of centuries for its wealth and now running at limited capital resources, could not support both establishment of factories and generation of employment opportunities for huge population base. But they identified that if they follow Gandhiji's principles of self-sustaining economics, they will be able to achieve both the tasks. See, the rural folks required minimum capital to get their khadi and cotton businesses up and running. And once this could be scaled up, this would eventually lead to employment generation for the masses, and that too at meager capital requirements. This ultimately resulted in small-scale industries becoming beneficiaries of protective measures owing to Gandhian model. The heavy industries receiving capital requirements for development of capital goods, and all this reflecting Gandhian principle of austerity for better economic control. Coming on to the final phase, where Gandhiji left a legacy of democratic decentralization for the country. These might sound like big opulent words, so let me put this into simpler context for you. You see, India is said to have one of the most complex democratic structures in the world. Our democracy does not take top to bottom approach, rather it takes a bottom up approach, like our economic foundations. Now you might be wondering, what do I mean exactly? So let me explain this via Gandhiji's concepts about the same. You see, Gandhiji always believed that our democracy should be a participatory democracy, which means that the entity Panchayati Raj should be the basic pillar for the democracy, which would provide the competing interest and thoughts by the people from every strata of society, with special inclusion for women. Gandhiji's approach was based on the rationale that the villages were the base of the political system, and the central government overlooking national governance should not be participating in these lower tiers of political system. And after numerous power struggles, controversies and iterations, since the 1956 decision to create a new Ministry of Community Development, Panchayati Raj and Corporation, it was not until 1992 that the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendment were passed, which formally introduced decentralized democracy system of 3 tiers with panchayats at village, block and district levels. But the question here arises, what is so significant about the Panchayati Raj system, and how is decentralized economy better for India? Well, the answer to this also lies in Gandhiji's visionary approach, as we discussed earlier. He knew that to usher in a development of the villages and to have better cooperation among the village folks, there was a need to establish a grassroots democratic structure which would plan for the basic services in the villages and plan for local economic development. Had it not been for the local government structure at the village level, there would not have been an inclusion of backward classes and women in the political structure. There would not be any elections in villages and districts. No leader will be chosen as representatives for the advancement of their villages, and thus the evolution of village mindset and overall development would still be stuck in limbo forever. So next time someone asks you about Gandhiji's contributions not just in achieving independence but beyond it, I'm sure you will have the answers now to educate them on his philosophies and ideological abstractions which are evident even today in our nation's policies and development. People, if you found the content to be useful and educational enough, make sure you like the video and subscribe to the channel for more such content. I will see you all in the next knowledge-filled episode. Mindfulness signing off.